In November of 1928, a French luxury liner steamed east across the Atlantic with 3 passengers seated at the same dinner table. One of them, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., already commanded one of the largest private fortunes in America. Beside him sat his wife of 14 years, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, mother of 7 children and daughter of a former mayor of Boston, a woman who attended Mass every morning of her adult life. Across from them sat Gloria Swanson, one of the most famous actresses in Hollywood and Joseph's mistress. For 6 days, Rose smiled at her, dined with her, asked politely after her health, and mentioned nothing. No fellow passenger recorded a crack in her composure. Rose knew. Most biographers of the family concluded that she knew, though not one of them ever located a letter, a diary page, or a remark to a friend in which she admitted it. She would lose a son to an exploding bomber, a daughter to a plane crash, 2 more sons to assassins, and a 4th child to a surgeon's incision, yet the single wound she never discussed with anyone belonged to the man sitting beside her at that table. Why would a woman submit to such humiliation, then keep submitting for 4 more decades? What does 60 years of silence cost the person who keeps it? Join me to find out. Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald arrived on the 22nd of July, 1890, into a city that drew its social boundaries with the precision of a surveyor's chain. Irish Catholics filled the wards and the parish halls of Boston, while the Protestant families of Beacon Hill kept the drawing rooms, the clubs, the banks, and the colleges for themselves. Her father, John Francis Fitzgerald, climbed the democratic machinery of the North End until the voters elected him mayor in 1906. The nickname he collected along the way, Honey Fitz, explained his method. He sang at weddings, wept at funerals, remembered 10,000 names, and never once forgot a grudge. Rose grew up as her father's political instrument. She stood beside him on platforms and poured tea for ward captains, and she later recalled her own hope of attending Wellesley College, a hope that collapsed when the family chose a convent instead. Most biographers credit Cardinal William O'Connell, Archbishop of Boston, with the advice that a Catholic girl belonged in a Catholic school. Her father decided, she obeyed. That pattern would repeat across the next 8 decades, with different men and identical results. They met in the summer of 1906 at Old Orchard Beach in Maine, where both families took their holidays. Rose turned 16 that summer. Joseph Patrick Kennedy, born in September of 1888, reached 18 a few weeks later, and he already carried the compressed ambition of a boy whose father owned saloons and delivered votes. Nothing about a seaside introduction between 2 teenagers announced a dynasty. Honey Fitz, though, understood precisely whose son stood in front of his daughter. Patrick Joseph Kennedy, known across East Boston as PJ, ran a ward organization that competed directly with the Fitzgerald machine on the other side of the harbor. The 2 men shared a religion, a party, a city, and a hunger for the same offices, and Boston politics of that era converted such overlap into open war. Honey Fitz opposed the courtship for 8 years. He opposed it loudly, and he opposed it with the full administrative power of a mayor who could relocate his daughter to another continent whenever young Joseph Kennedy drew too close. In 1908, Rose enrolled at Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart in New York, a placement her father arranged with the affection of a man building a fence. 2 years later, she crossed the ocean to a convent school at Blumenthal in Prussia, and afterward to another in Paris. German came first, then French, then the particular Catholicism of the pre-Vatican II convent, with its rigid schedules and its teaching that a woman's suffering purchased currency in the next world. Boston lay 4,000 miles behind her, and Joseph Kennedy wrote to her anyway, letter after letter, across the ocean her father paid for. The distance changed nothing. Boston folklore preserves a line from Honey Fitz about young Joe Kennedy, a sentence involving worst enemies in marriage repeated in 100 retellings and never once recorded at the time by anyone present in the room. Historians now treat the phrase as embellishment rather than transcript, though the sentiment behind it matches everything else on the record. Honey Fitz wanted a different husband. He spent the better part of a decade proving it through geography, tuition payments, chaperones, and the careful scheduling of European tours that kept an ocean between his daughter and East Boston. Joseph waited, and while he waited, he climbed. At 25, he took control of the Columbia Trust Company in East Boston, a small bank his own father helped to found, and the newspapers described him as the youngest bank president in America. The claim flattered him and probably overstated the truth. Either way, Joseph Kennedy now ran a bank, and a mayor who dealt in influence understood the arithmetic of that perfectly well. The strategy failed. On the 7th of October, 1914, Rose Fitzgerald married Joseph Kennedy in the private chapel of Cardinal O'Connell, who 6 years earlier steered her toward the convent. Rose turned 24 that July. Joseph turned 26 a month before the ceremony. No cathedral crowds, no press stampede, nothing a mayor's daughter of that era might reasonably expect. The ceremony passed in front of a small gathering, quickly and without spectacle. The couple moved into a modest house at 83 Beale Street in Brookline, a comfortable address in a comfortable suburb, purchased with money Joseph earned in banking. 9 children would follow. Rose crossed that threshold carrying the conviction, drilled into her at Blumenthal in Paris, that a wife absorbs whatever a wife receives. Whether Joseph crossed it with any conviction at all remains a question his biographers still argue over. He wanted sons, capital, political access, and a surname the Brahmins could not refuse, and Rose delivered the first of those 4 requirements with a speed that consumed her 20s entirely. Joseph Kennedy pursued money with the concentration other men reserve for religion. He rose through Boston banking while barely into his 20s, moved into shipbuilding during the war, and then into the stock market, where the loose rules of the 1920s allowed a clever operator to manufacture fortunes out of other people's optimism. Work kept him away from Brookline for weeks at a stretch. Rose, alone in the house with the children, learned the shape of a marriage conducted largely by telegram. The children came without pause: Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr. in July of 1915, John Fitzgerald Kennedy in May of 1917. Rosemary arrived in September of 1918 during the influenza pandemic, and several biographers report that a delayed delivery starved the infant of oxygen for a span of minutes that would define the rest of her life. Kathleen, whom the family called Kick, arrived in February of 1920. 4 children in 6 years, and Rose turned 30 only that summer, in a house she seldom left. Joseph missed most of it. Through the war, he ran a shipyard at Fore River, sleeping at the plant for weeks together, and in the autumn of 1918, the influenza swept through Boston, while Rose delivered their 3rd child with the doctor delayed elsewhere in the hospital. Rose recovered. The nation counted its dead. The schools closed, the churches emptied, the theaters shuttered, and a young mother in Brookline nursed an infant nobody yet recognized as damaged. The church forbade contraception. Her husband wanted heirs, her father would tolerate no complaint from a married woman, and Boston in 1920 supplied no vocabulary for what she felt. Convent training supplied the rest. Exhaustion belonged to the ordinary condition of a Catholic wife rather than to any injustice worth naming. Rose did not complain. She did not complain where anyone could hear her, at any rate, and no letter, no diary page, no confessor, and no friend of hers ever recorded a single word of protest against the life her husband arranged. Strain surfaced early. Joseph's absences stretched from days into weeks, and the frequent pregnancies left Rose physically depleted in a house she rarely left, except to walk to Mass. Money never posed a problem, and everything else did. Friends who visited Brookline in those years noticed a young wife of unusual poise and unusual isolation. She ran a nursery that grew larger every 18 months, while her husband built a fortune in a city she barely saw. Late in 1920, Rose Kennedy left her husband. She carried a 5th child at the time, a daughter who would arrive the following July under the name Eunice, and she carried 30 years of a life in which nobody ever asked what she wanted. The older children traveled with her. Her destination lay 3 miles away, at her parents' house in Dorchester, and she intended, according to the family accounts, to end the marriage. Her father refused to take her in. No transcript of the conversation exists, and the words attributed to him descend through oral family lore, passed principally through Rose's sister Agnes, and recorded decades afterward by the biographer Lawrence Leamer. In that version, Honeyfitz reminded his daughter that she chose her bed and would lie in it, and that a Catholic woman does not divorce. Historians treat the wording with caution, and nobody disputes the outcome. Rose returned to Brookline within weeks. The marriage continued for another 49 years, and across the 12 years that followed her return, she bore 5 more children: Eunice, Patricia, Robert, Jean, and Edward. 9 in all. Whatever protest she carried into Dorchester in 1920, she left it in her mother's front room. Something closed in her that winter, and the woman who walked back through the door at Beale Street bore only a partial resemblance to the girl who once poured tea for ward captains. She stopped asking. In place of asking, she constructed a life that required nothing whatever from her husband: a schedule, a faith, a set of rituals, and eventually a filing system. Her father lived until 1950 and died at 87, so far as anyone knows, convinced he acted rightly. By 1927, Joseph Kennedy controlled a film studio and a fortune built on stocks, and Hollywood interested him more with every passing month. He met Gloria Swanson that year. Swanson ranked among the biggest stars in American film, a woman of 28 whose face sold more magazines than any politician's. And within months, Joseph controlled her finances, produced her pictures through a company called Gloria Productions, and shared her bed. Both of them wore wedding rings, and neither of them pretended otherwise in private. In November of 1928, the 3 of them sailed for Europe together aboard the Ile-de-France. Joseph arranged it. Rose accepted the arrangement and spent the voyage in the company of the woman whose name Boston whispered whenever her husband entered a room, and she did it without a raised voice and without a word to anyone. Photographs from that period show the 2 women standing side by side, both of them smiling. Swanson later wrote that Rose treated her with unfailing warmth throughout the crossing. Swanson puzzled over that warmth for the rest of her life. In her memoir, published more than 50 years afterward, Swanson turned the problem over and never once solved it, landing finally on 3 possibilities and refusing to choose among them: a saint, a fool, or an actress finer than herself. Swanson never picked. Every biographer since picked one of the 3, and the choice a writer settles on describes the writer rather than Rose Kennedy. Swanson departed the story around 1930, and the pattern did not depart with her. Gossip in Hollywood and in the Capitol attached Joseph's name to secretaries and actresses across the following 30 years, and to more than one woman employed inside his own houses, and his sons absorbed the lesson so thoroughly that 2 of them carried the same habits into the White House. Rose never addressed any of it. Not to a priest, not to a sister, not to a friend, and not to a child. Her daughter Eunice, questioned about her father's affairs long afterward, answered that her mother never mentioned the subject, and then repeated the word never 3 separate times, as though a single denial lacked the strength to carry so much weight. Rose Kennedy attended Mass every morning for roughly 80 years. In Brookline, in Bronxville, in Hyannisport, and in Palm Beach, she walked to church whatever the weather, sometimes covering several miles on foot before the household woke. The theology she practiced belonged to a church that no longer exists. It demanded submission, rewarded suffering, forbade divorce absolutely, and promised an accounting in the next world for every humiliation swallowed quietly in this one. The Catholicism of Rose's generation drew a hard line around marriage and permitted nothing to cross it. Annulment existed in theory and almost never in practice for a woman of her station. Divorce meant excommunication from the only community that granted her an identity, and a Catholic wife who abandoned her husband forfeited her children, her family, her standing in the parish, and any reasonable hope of heaven. Rose understood the terms. She accepted them at 24 and never revisited them across the following 70 years. From the early 1920s onward, she traveled to Europe alone, once a year, for 6 to 8 weeks at a stretch. The children remained behind with governesses in Massachusetts or New York. Rose shopped in Paris, prayed in Rome, studied the couture houses, and sent back instructions. Barbara Perry, one of her biographers, advances a theory that the trips worked as contraception the church could not condemn, since a wife who spends 2 months abroad conceives no children. Other historians reject the reading, and no letter from Rose supports it. At home, she ran the household through paper. A file of 3 by 5 index cards, 1 card for each child, recorded weights, illnesses, dental appointments, vaccination dates, and shoe sizes, updated in her own hand across 3 decades. When a child required correction or instruction, Rose wrote the message on a slip of paper and pinned it to his clothing. Rose rarely raised her voice. She rarely used it at all, if a note could carry the point instead, and the children grew up understanding that their mother communicated by memorandum. By the 1930s, the couple slept in separate bedrooms, an arrangement they carried from the Bronxville house down to Palm Beach and finally to Hyannisport, where each of them would eventually die. The arrangement never varied again. Meanwhile, the children learned to describe a marriage that none of them ever actually witnessed. And John Kennedy, campaigning for the presidency, told the country he never once heard a crossword pass between his parents. He told the truth, in a narrow sense, since crosswords require conversation. Rosemary Kennedy turned 23 in 1941. She read at a 4th grade level and wrote long, affectionate letters in an unsteady hand. By 1941, she suffered violent mood swings and episodes of rage that terrified a family built on the appearance of control. At night, she slipped out of her convent school. Joseph Kennedy, then 53, feared scandal above almost everything, and a daughter wandering the Capitol after dark threatened the political futures he already mapped out for his sons. He consulted physicians. 2 of them, Dr. Walter Freeman and Dr. James Watts, promoted a new operation that severed connections in the frontal lobe of the brain. And in November of 1941, they performed it on Rosemary at George Washington University Hospital. Watts described the operation years afterward to the writer Ronald Kessler. They entered through the top of the skull and the patient remained awake under a mild tranquilizer, reciting on command while the surgeon cut, and the doctor stopped only when her responses stopped. The operation still carried the shine of novelty in 1941. Freeman and Watts promoted it across American hospitals as a cure for agitation, depression, anxiety, and disorder of nearly every description. And the medical press of the period treated the 2 men as pioneers rather than as the wreckers a later generation would call them. Tens of thousands of Americans underwent the operation before it fell out of use. Joseph Kennedy consulted the profession and told almost nobody else. Rose's knowledge of the operation divides her biographers more sharply than any other question about her. For decades, the family maintained that Joseph acted alone, and Rose herself insisted she learned nothing until the operation ended, a claim Doris Kearns Goodwin accepted in her 1987 history of the 2 families. Kate Clifford Larson, working from the medical correspondence, reached a different conclusion. Rose sat through the psychiatric consultations. She read the assessments, and she understood, in all likelihood, that surgeons planned to open her daughter's skull, whatever she chose to remember afterward. The operation destroyed her. Rosemary emerged unable to speak more than a few words, unable to walk without help, incontinent and permanently dependent on the care of strangers who would keep her for the rest of her life. The family hid her at Craig House, a private psychiatric facility in Beacon, New York, from 1941 until 1949. In 1949, they moved her to St. Coletta in Jefferson, Wisconsin, where she would live for another 56 years. Joseph Kennedy never visited his daughter after the operation, and Rose kept away for more than 20 years. Rose Kennedy carried a rosary to Mass every morning for the rest of her long life. Her 3rd child sat in a Wisconsin institution, ruined by an operation her husband authorized and she perhaps permitted. And the subject never once surfaced in the family's conversation or correspondence for decades afterward. The household practiced silence the way other families practice religion. It cost nothing, and it protected everyone except the person it erased. On the 12th of August, 1944, Lieutenant Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. climbed into a bomber packed with 20,000 pounds of explosive and lifted off from an airfield in Suffolk. He would bail out over the English coast, and the bomber would fly on by radio control toward a German rocket site. That plan never reached its 2nd stage. The bomber detonated in midair before he reached the jump point, and nothing of him came back. He died at 29, and his father spent every one of those years preparing him for the presidency. Joseph Kennedy Sr. collapsed. He shut himself in his bedroom at Hyannisport and lay there in the dark for days, refusing food and the man who bent markets and studios to his will discovered something that money could not reach. Rose behaved differently. She attended Mass as usual, walked on the beach, greeted the neighbors, and then gathered the family together to deliver an instruction that would govern the Kennedys for the next quarter century. No tears in this house. The rule originated in 1944, not in 1963, and not in 1968, though the popular version of the story assigns it to the assassinations. Rose issued it over her firstborn. Grief, she reasoned, indulged the self at the expense of the living, and a family with public duties could not afford the spectacle of a mother weeping. The surviving children obeyed for the rest of their lives, and the discipline held through Dallas in 1963, and through a hotel pantry in Los Angeles in 1968. She lost her eldest son in 1944, her second daughter in 1948, her second son in 1963, and her third son in 1968. And she appeared in public after each of those deaths with dry eyes and a composed face. The country read her composure as strength, and some of it deserved the name. 40 years of practice supplied the rest. Kathleen Kennedy, called Kick by everyone who loved her, fell for an English aristocrat during the war. William Cavendish, Marquis of Hartington, heir to the Duke of Devonshire, belonged to one of the most prominent Protestant houses in Britain, with a lineage of anti-Catholic politics behind it. Rose opposed the marriage with everything she owned. She threatened disownment, enlisted priests, wrote letters, and finally refused to attend the wedding on the 6th of May, 1944. Cavendish died in Belgium 4 months afterward, shot by a German sniper. Kick, widowed at 24, remained in England. Rose regarded the death as an answer from heaven, and her daughter understood exactly how her mother read it. 4 years later, Kick fell in love again. She chose Peter Fitzwilliam, the 8th Earl Fitzwilliam, a Protestant and a married man whose own divorce proceedings dragged on in the background, which placed him beyond every line her mother ever drew. Rose threatened to cut her off from the family money and to erase her from the family entirely. Joseph, characteristically, negotiated. He agreed to meet the couple in Paris in May of 1948 and to consider the matter, and the plane carrying Kick and Fitzwilliam toward that meeting flew into a storm over the Rhone Valley on the 13th of May and crashed into a mountainside. Kick died at 28. Rose's reaction survives in the accounts of those around her. She read the crash as a judgment from heaven upon a daughter who defied her church, and she declined to travel to England for the funeral. Her stated reason involved medical tests. She checked into the New England Baptist Hospital in Boston while her daughter descended into a grave at St. Peter's Churchyard in Edensor on a Derbyshire hillside belonging to the Devonshire family. Joseph Kennedy stood at that grave alone, the only Kennedy who attended. On the 19th of December, 1961, Joseph Kennedy played 18 holes of golf in Palm Beach and complained of dizziness on the drive home. And before the afternoon ended, a massive stroke dropped him. He survived it. The damage paralyzed his right side and wrecked the speech centers of his brain, so that the man who commanded studios, banks, ambassadors, and a president could produce exactly one word for the remaining 8 years of his life: no. Rose turned 71 that summer. Her husband lived until 1969, and across those 8 years, she supplied almost none of his daily care. Anne Gargan, his niece, moved into the house and took charge of him day to day. Professional nurses handled the rest. Chief among them, Rita Dallas later published an account of the household and found in it a distance between husband and wife that she never fully explained to her readers. Dallas recorded the schedule. Rose attended Mass at 7, played golf in the morning, took her meals apart, and visited her husband at fixed hours for a fixed number of minutes. She spoke to him about the weather and the grandchildren, and then she withdrew. The wheelchair that carried one of the richest men in America sat wherever the nurses left it, and Rose arranged her day so that she never needed to look at it for long. Twice during those 8 years, the house filled with reporters. In November of 1963, a bullet killed the second son in Dallas, and in June of 1968, another killed the third son in a Los Angeles hotel pantry. Both times, the family wheeled Joseph Kennedy in front of a television set so that a man who could not speak could watch the funerals of the sons he built. Rose attended the Requiem Mass for both. She wore black and took communion, and she returned to her schedule the following morning. Joseph Kennedy died on the 18th of November, 1969, at the age of 81, in the house at Hyannisport. He never spoke a full sentence again after 1961. The man who arranged his daughter's lobotomy, conducted his affairs in front of his wife, financed the campaigns of 3 sons, and directed the lives of 9 children from behind a telephone, spent his last 8 years dependent on women he could no longer command. And one of those women prayed for him every morning without once sitting long at his side. In 1974, at 84, Rose Kennedy published a memoir titled Times to Remember. The book sold well. It described a happy marriage, an attentive husband, a devoted father, and a family blessed and then tested by God. And it omitted Gloria Swanson entirely, along with every other woman, along with the operation performed on Rosemary, whose condition the text presents as a natural affliction of mental retardation rather than the result of an operation. Her account of the marriage rests on a single sentence. Rose wrote of her husband, "He left me in peace to manage my children and my household." Read one way, the sentence pays a compliment. Turned over, it records a bargain in which a woman traded her marriage for a jurisdiction, accepted the humiliation, kept the children, and never again asked for anything her husband did not already intend to give her. The public account of Rosemary required its own maintenance. Ronald Kessler, investigating the family decades afterward, quoted a former director of the National Institute of Mental Health who explained the terminology. Describing Rosemary as retarded rather than mentally ill protected John Kennedy's political prospects, since voters of that era treated hereditary insanity as disqualifying. The distinction rescued a presidency. It cost a woman 6 decades inside institutions, and nobody in the family corrected the record while Rose Kennedy lived. In 2006, the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library opened 300 boxes of Rose Kennedy's private papers. 11 years passed between her death and the unsealing of those boxes. Historians expected the serene woman of the memoir. What the letters and diaries delivered instead: a mother frantic about her children's health, a wife marooned for weeks in empty houses, a Catholic recording spells of depression, and a woman who mentioned none of it to a priest, a friend, a daughter, or a printing press. The private record contradicts the published one on nearly every page. The family eventually turned the wound into a cause. Eunice, the daughter who insisted her mother never spoke of anything, founded the Special Olympics in 1968 and pushed the country toward a kinder vocabulary for people like her sister. Rose lived long enough to watch that movement spread across the world. She never publicly connected it to the operation, and she never wrote a single page explaining why the Kennedy who most needed protection received the least of it. Her biographers divide over what to call her. Doris Kearns Goodwin portrays a woman who chose not to see, retreating into ritual and schedule to preserve her sanity. Barbara Perry rejects the pure victim, arguing that Rose built the Kennedy mystique with her own hands and treated the production of perfect children as her life's work. David Nassau describes a cold and functional patriarchy in which Joseph ran everything while his wife withdrew into faith and travel. Lawrence Leamer, the biographer who named the marriage a silent hell, credits her discipline and her faith while insisting she paid a terrible price for both. Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy died on the 22nd of January, 1995, at Hyannisport. She reached 104, 55 of those years married to Joseph, 26 of them widowed, and she outlived 4 of her 9 children, while a 5th lived on in a Wisconsin institution, unvisited by her mother for 20 of those years. The public called her the matriarch. She left behind 300 boxes, and inside them, written in her own hand and sealed for a generation, lay the tears she forbade her family to shed. Camelot. An entire country swallowed it whole. 1,000 days of a golden couple crossing a marble floor, the handsome president and the elegant first lady in her pillbox hat, all of us desperate to believe that grace and power could share one bed without a crack in the porcelain. The porcelain cracked in year 1. what the nation bought as the great love story of the century ran, behind its own front door, closer to a standoff than a romance. Two people bound together by ambition, faith, wounded pride, and a father-in-law who priced the whole union like a corporate merger. She knew the man cheated before the honeymoon plates cooled. He knew she knew, and both of them kept smiling for the cameras, because the cameras, in the end, belonged to them. This corner of American memory deserves the telling with the lights on. Not the fairy tale a widow sold us out of her grief, and not the sneering supermarket tabloid version either, but the harder thing wedged underneath both. A marriage that buckled 3 separate times, clawed its way back through sheer stubbornness, and found something like peace roughly 11 weeks before a rifle erased it in Dallas. Grab a drink and settle in, because this story earns the ache it leaves behind. May 1952. A dinner party in Washington, thrown by Charles and Martha Bartlett, dropped a rising congressman across a table from a 22-year-old debutante with a camera-ready smile and a French vocabulary that could slice glass. The Bartletts played matchmaker on purpose. They eyed Jacqueline Lee Bouvier's aristocratic polish and her Catholic upbringing, and they decided the ambitious John Fitzgerald Kennedy needed exactly that on his arm. One man wanted the match more than either of the young people did. Joseph P. Kennedy, the patriarch, the bootlegger, turned ambassador, the puppet master of the entire dynasty, took one look at Jackie and totted up her worth like an accountant pricing a rare painting. Biographer Sarah Bradford records how quickly old Joe grasped the arithmetic. The girl spoke fluent French, carried genuine cultural weight, and draped the brash new money Kennedys in exactly the old world respectability their fortune could never buy outright. Jackie's mother saw the same family and recoiled. Janet Auchincloss regarded the Kennedys as loud, coarse, and hopelessly common beside her own careful pedigree, and she barely hid her preference for almost anyone else as a son-in-law. The arithmetic worked in both directions, at least on paper. Kennedy needed a wife who could stand beside a future president without wilting, and Jackie needed an escape hatch from a mother forever fretting over money and matches. Love flickered somewhere in that mix, real enough, though so did cold calculation on every side of the table. Understand who Jackie already amounted to before any Kennedy entered the frame. She spoke French, Spanish, and Italian, sketched with real skill, and worked a genuine job as the inquiring camera girl for a Washington paper, roaming the Capitol to snap photographs and needle strangers with clever questions. A year studying in Paris sharpened both her taste and her armor. Men underestimated the soft voice constantly, and she let them, filing away everything they revealed, while they assumed the pretty debutante followed none of it. That habit of watching, cataloging, and offering almost nothing would define the marriage ahead far more than anyone at that first dinner could possibly guess. Jackie herself walked in clear-eyed. JFK's intellect and charisma pulled hard at her, yet his reputation as a womanizer worried her just as much. In January 1953, months before any ring, she wrote to an Irish priest named Father Joseph Leonard and laid out the fear that would stalk the next decade of her life. Her husband, she predicted, would mirror her own philandering father, a man who hungered for the chase and lost all interest the moment he won, who once married would flirt with other women to prove he still could, and who would resent the wife who witnessed it. The same pattern nearly killed her mother. In full view of a watching daughter, she married him anyway. The proposal itself dissolved into legend. Boston's Omni Parker House swears Kennedy popped the question at table 40, while Martin's Tavern in Georgetown insists it happened in booth 3. Historians shrug at the venue and agree only on the timing. Kennedy proposed just before Jackie sailed for London to cover the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II for the Washington Times-Herald, and she promptly stalled, crossed an ocean, photographed a queen, and accepted only once she returned. The engagement broke into the papers on June 25, 1953. September 12, 1953, at St. Mary's Church in Newport, Rhode Island. Jackie pictured something small, a quiet Catholic ceremony with family and a handful of friends, the kind of wedding a private woman dreams about her whole life. Old Joe pictured a coronation. The patriarch seized the day and rebuilt it as a campaign rally. 700 guests packed the church. 1,200 more crowded the reception at Hammersmith Farm, the Auchincloss estate overlooking the water, while photographers swarmed every angle. The bride, who pleaded for intimacy, found herself paraded before a small army of strangers, and witnesses close enough to notice remembered how drained and rattled she looked under the weight of all those staring eyes. The message landed before the cake did. Inside this family, the private woman would never choose the terms of her own life. The machine chose them for her, dressed the choice in spotless white, and mailed the photographs straight to the morning papers before the champagne even lost its fizz. She married the man that afternoon. She also married the corporation standing behind him, and that corporation answered to one chairman. Marriage dropped Jackie into the strangest athletic cult in America, the Kennedy compound at Hyannisport. The whole place hummed with competition. Picture an introvert who loved French poetry, long silences, and horses, suddenly airlifted into a boot camp run by loud, competitive, sunburned overachievers who treated a stretch of beach lawn like contested territory. The Kennedys ran on motion, touch football at full sprint, screaming political arguments over dinner. Matriarch Rose Kennedy's iron schedules that governed every hour of daylight, down to the minute. Sit still in that house, and the family read it as weakness. Lose at a game, and you might as well hand over your resignation. Jackie, who craved a novel and a quiet horse far more than any of it, moved through the place like an anthropologist, trapped among a tribe that never once stopped shouting. Rose Kennedy ruled the domestic side with the discipline of a drill sergeant and the piety of a mother superior. She posted meal times on index cards, quizzed the grandchildren on current events across the dinner table, and expected every woman who married in to produce children on a strict Catholic timetable. Jackie, who guarded her privacy like a jewel, chafed against the constant surveillance of that house, where doors rarely closed and solitude counted as a minor betrayal of the clan. Jack, for his part, offered little cover. He loved the chaos he grew up inside, and he could never quite register why the woman he married kept flinching away from it. Her sister Lee Radziwill watched Jackie snap an ankle during one especially brutal round of touch football, and the injury handed her the single thing money could not, a doctor's excuse to sit the whole ritual out. She took it gratefully. The famous line about Jackie branding the clan, the guerrillas, probably belongs to later biographers reaching for color, since historians struggle to trace it to her actual mouth. Her documented insult cut softer, yet landed cleaner. She christened the relentlessly peppy Kennedy sisters the Rah-Rah Girls, a nickname that dripped with the exact boarding school disdain the family already suspected in her. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. put their early verdict plainly. They pegged the new bride as a snob. Here the fairy tale curdles. JFK's cheating did not creep in slowly over the years. It detonated more or less on schedule, right after the wedding, and it never once let up until the afternoon he died. The man collected affairs the way other men collect stamps, and the roster reads like a fever dream of mid-century America. Mary Pinchot Meyer, a Georgetown painter and the sister-in-law of Washington Post editor Ben Bradlee, drifted through his orbit for years. Judith Campbell Exner shared a bed with the president and, at the very same time, with Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana, a detail explosive enough to topple a presidency that somehow stayed buried for years. Then came Mimi Alford, 19 years old, a White House intern whose 2012 memoir, Once Upon a Secret, documents an 18-month affair conducted inside the residence itself, corroborated and unflinching. The Marilyn Monroe rumors, the ones every barstool historian recites, mostly evaporate under real scrutiny. Robert Dallek and other careful scholars place the whole contact at a single brief 1962 encounter. The tabloid writers later inflated into a full-blown opera. The pattern never broke. Jackie knew everything, and the knowing changed nothing about the face she showed the world. Ben Bradlee's 1995 memoir, A Good Life, preserves the coldest illustration of that knowledge, delivered during a routine White House tour. Gliding past a young staffer named Priscilla Ware, nicknamed Fiddle, Jackie turned to a Paris Match reporter walking beside her and remarked, in French, with the flat calm of a woman reading a weather report, "There walks the young woman rumored to share my husband's bed. she sailed onward without a flicker. Why swallow it? Sally Bedell Smith frames Jackie's tolerance as a kind of aristocratic bargain struck long before she ever met a Kennedy. In the world she came from, powerful men strayed and a wife of breeding endured it, so long as the straying never curdled into public humiliation. Private betrayal, she could stomach. A front-page headline she could not. Kennedy, for all his recklessness, grasped that line as sharply as she did, and for years he stayed just barely on the survivable side of it. The marriage bent under the weight of all those women, over and over, without quite snapping. The bargain cost her more than she ever let strangers glimpse. She retreated into cigarettes, into horses, into the company of a small circle of confidants who knew the score and kept it quiet. Friends noticed the way she stiffened whenever a pretty young secretary crossed the room, and the way her wit turned a shade crueler in the years the affairs ran hottest. She never staged a scene, never threw a lamp, never handed the press a single crack to pry at. Underneath the composure, though, a quiet accounting ran on, and every fresh betrayal added another entry to a ledger she would settle, decisively, only after the man himself lay dead. Behind the glamour, the marriage limped through, a medical nightmare the public never once glimpsed. JFK carried Addison's disease, a hormonal disorder the family guarded like a state secret, along with a spine that tortured him through every waking hour. 2 high-risk operations on that spine, the first in October 1954 and the second in February 1955 at New York's Hospital for Special Surgery, very nearly finished him off for good. Infection set in both times. A priest administered the Catholic last rites twice over, and twice the stubborn man refused to oblige him by dying. Through those grim months, Jackie nursed him, read aloud to him, propped up his sinking spirits, and steadied a household already bracing for a funeral. The crisis pulled the two of them closer than years of ordinary distance ever allowed, one of those cruel intimacies that only catastrophe seems to arrange, and for a season, the marriage actually breathed. Then biology turned on them again. Concealment ran in the family like a second bloodline. The Kennedys hid the Addison's diagnosis from voters and reporters alike, since a president's frailty wrecked good campaign copy, and Jackie learned the craft of the cover-up at close range during those hospital vigils. She watched a machine bury inconvenient facts under press releases and smiling photographs, and she absorbed the lesson completely. Years later, that same talent for managing a story would hand her the tools to remake her marriage in the public imagination, long after the man at the center of it could no longer contradict a single word she chose. The summer of 1956 promised to crown the marriage at last. Jackie carried a pregnancy into its final weeks after losing an earlier one to miscarriage in 1955, and a healthy baby seemed close enough to touch. Her husband, meanwhile, floated somewhere off the Mediterranean coast on a chartered yacht with Senator George Smathers, chasing sun and whatever else happened to drift past the railing. On August 23, 1956, in Newport, Jackie hemorrhaged and delivered a stillborn daughter they named Arabella. The father learned of the loss from the deck of a chartered yacht in the Mediterranean, and the decision he reached in that moment fractured the marriage right down to its foundation. At first, he simply kept sailing, let that settle past the gloss of legend. His wife lay in a hospital bed mourning a dead daughter, and the man weighed his vacation against her grief and, for 3 full days, picked the vacation. Smathers later claimed in his oral histories that he grabbed Kennedy by the metaphorical collar and barked at him to haul his ass back to his wife if he ever wanted the presidency. Handle that quote with tongs. Smathers relished a good story, especially one that cast Smathers as the hero, and historians treat his cinematic dialogue as self-flattering reconstruction long after the fact. The delay itself, though, sits in the record beyond dispute. Kennedy came home 3 days late, and Jackie filed the wound away, quietly, alongside all the others. Something in Jackie hardened permanently that August. The girl who once poured her fears onto a priest's stationery now understood, with cold clarity, exactly the marriage she owned. Divorce hovered close enough to taste through that autumn, and the couple's friends braced for the announcement that never arrived. Whatever kept her in place through those bleak months, whether faith, exhaustion, raw ambition, or the simple arithmetic of a woman with painfully few good exits in 1956, it held firm against every reason to walk out. She stayed, and she banked the resentment for a reckoning far down the road. After Arabella, the marriage bottomed out completely. Friends of the couple whispered, loudly and often, that Jackie weighed divorce in earnest through the last months of 1956. Into that vacuum rushed one of the most durable legends in the whole Kennedy canon, the tale that Joe Kennedy summoned his daughter-in-law and dangled $1 million in front of her to keep the marriage intact and his son's White House dreams alive. It plays beautifully on screen, and it collapses the instant anyone checks the paperwork. Sensational biographers like J. Randy Taraborelli and Edward Klein kept the story spinning for decades, yet no financial record, no trust document, no living witness ever surfaced to back a single dollar of it. Serious historians, Robert Dallek and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. among them, waved the whole thing off as tabloid folklore, a myth that survives precisely because it flatters our appetite for a cynical old villain buying love with a checkbook. The genuine hinge swung on November 27, 1957, when Caroline Bouvier Kennedy arrived healthy and squalling. Fatherhood ambushed JFK. That chronic philanderer, the man who treated commitment like an optional accessory, melted around his daughter with a tenderness nobody in the family recognized. Evelyn Lincoln, his secretary and a first-hand witness, watched Jack's open adoration of Caroline throw a fragile bridge back across the gap between him and his wife. Tensions from the previous year eased their grip. A functional partnership took shape, steady enough to carry them both into the 1960 campaign, and for a little while the porcelain looked almost whole again. The truce, though, rested on ground nobody would mistake for solid. Caroline softened her father without reforming him, and the affairs resumed their old rhythm inside a year, discreet enough now to spare the marriage another open wound. Jackie recalibrated rather than forgave. She accepted a husband who adored his children and betrayed his wife in roughly equal measure, and she carved out enough private space to keep the whole arrangement bearable. By the time the 1960 campaign swallowed them whole, the two of them functioned less like newlyweds and more like partners in a demanding, high-stakes firm held together by the children, the faith, the shared ambition, and a mutual understanding neither of them would ever name aloud. Power did not fuse them. It let them build separate kingdoms under one very famous roof. On camera, Jackie reigned as the flawless First Lady, the whisper voice style icon who restored the White House and so thoroughly eclipsed her husband in Paris that he joked history would file him under the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to France. Off camera, the two of them orbited each other at a careful, deliberate distance. She loathed the fishbowl of Washington from the first week. To breathe, she fled constantly to Glen Ora, the couple's leased estate in Middleburg, Virginia, where she rode horses across the hunt country and let the presidency shrink to a distant rumor. Long, glittering trips carried her far from him too, most famously to Ravello, Italy, in the summer of 1962, where she lingered for weeks in the company of Fiat heir Gianni Agnelli, while the tabloids back home sharpened their pencils. Picture the split for a moment. The public devoured a fantasy of romance, mailing fan letters to a couple they imagined giggling together over breakfast, while the actual husband and wife booked separate itineraries across separate continents. Reporters photographed Jackie on Agnelli's yacht and printed coy captions, and JFK cabled his wife a testy reminder to spend less time with Gianni and more time with Caroline, an instruction dripping with the nerve of a man who betted half of Washington. Neither of them cared to correct the fantasy. The fantasy, after all, kept the voters content, and content voters kept the whole operation running. Her husband, meanwhile, ran on chemistry. Dr. Max Jacobson, nicknamed Dr. Feelgood, pumped him full of vitamin injections laced heavily with amphetamines. Tread carefully here because the two of them did not share a habit. JFK leaned on those needles hard through the worst stretches, while Jackie's own use stayed rare and strictly roped off to specific high-pressure moments, like the punishing 1961 Paris summit, Lump the pair together, and you flatten a genuine difference between chemical dependence and the occasional terrible week. The White House marriage ran on compartments. As a political double act, they dazzled, syncing flawlessly for the cameras and the crowds and the foreign heads of state. As a private couple, they lived in parallel, two people who respected each other's talents and shared a bed less and less. Jackie once told her friend William Walton exactly how little she intended to perform the role for the public. She flatly refused to become the first lady who parked herself at the White House for the whole country to gawk at. No scandal finally cracked the two of them open. A coffin did. On August 7th, 1963, 5.5 weeks ahead of schedule, Jackie delivered a fragile son at Otis Air Force Base, and the couple named him Patrick Bouvier Kennedy. His lungs, ravaged by hyaline membrane disease, could not manage the simple work of breathing. Doctors raced the infant to Boston Children's Hospital, where he died on August 9th, 39 hours into a life that never once found its footing. The country never saw the depth of it. Publicly, the administration absorbed the loss and pressed forward within days. Yet privately, the parents circled each other in a shared grief that finally outweighed a decade of accumulated damage. Jackie, who spent years guarding her heart against a husband who kept breaking it, lowered the guard at last. Loss accomplished what happiness never could, and the couple emerged from that ruined summer clinging to each other with an intimacy their friends long ago stopped expecting. Patrick's death broke something loose in JFK that decades of practiced charm kept sealed. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, whose eyewitness accounts carry the weight of gospel among Kennedy scholars, watched the president come apart at the hospital. Shoulders heaving, face wet, a man weeping without a scrap of performance left in him. Grief accomplished what 15 years of marriage never quite managed, welding the two of them together at last. During her 1964 oral history, Jackie recalled turning to Jack in that hospital and confessing the one fear that now towered over every old resentment. Losing him ranked as the single blow she could not survive. That autumn, White House aides began noticing scenes almost none of them expected to witness. The president and the first lady held hands. They lingered near each other, traded soft looks, moved through their days with the ease of two people who at last, and at terrible cost, learned to love the person they married. The price of that peace ran cruelly high, and the calendar left them almost no time at all to spend it. 11 weeks stood between their hard-won peace and the rifle that shredded it on November 22nd, 1963. The motorcade rolled through Dealey Plaza under a bright Texas sun. Rifle fire cracked across the plaza, and the president slumped, fatally struck against his wife. Jackie's first instinct, captured forever on film, sent her scrambling onto the trunk of the moving limousine, either reaching for a fragment of her husband's skull or reaching in pure animal panic for a way out. Clint Hill flung himself onto the back of the car and heard what she cried, words he later repeated under oath to the Warren Commission, a cry that her husband lay murdered and she cradled a piece of him in her own hand. At Parkland Memorial Hospital, Jackie planted herself and would not budge. She refused every gentle order to leave the trauma room, telling the doctors she meant to stay beside her husband until the very end. Then came the moment that turned raw horror into deliberate iconography. Aides and Lady Bird Johnson pressed her to change. Out of the pink Chanel suit soaked in her husband's blood, before Lyndon Johnson took the oath aboard Air Force One, and Jackie refused with a ferocity that reshaped the whole record. Consider the sheer control that decision demanded. Hours earlier, a bullet tore through her husband's head inches from her face, spattering her lap with bone and tissue. Any ordinary person might collapse into shock, begging for clean clothes in a dark room. Jackie instead calculated. She grasped, with a clarity that should chill anyone who studies it, that the sight of a blood-soaked widow standing beside the new president would burn itself into the national memory and never wash out, and she chose to become that image on purpose. The exact words she chose flicker a little depending on the witness. Lady Bird Johnson's audio diary, recorded almost immediately, remembers a quiet, wounded line about letting the world see what they did. Kennedy aides such as Kenneth O'Donnell later sharpened it into the version that entered legend, the fierce line about wanting them to see what they did to Jack. Either way, the instinct underneath ran ice cold and brilliant. A woman drowning in fresh trauma understood in real time that the blood on her skirt would indict an entire nation and canonize her husband, and she wore it like armor the whole flight back to Washington. 1 week after Dallas, in an interview with journalist Theodore White, a grieving widow reached for a Broadway musical and handed America the word that would bury the whole ugly business: Camelot. She built the myth on purpose. In the spring of 1964, sitting for a series of oral history sessions with Arthur Schlesinger Jr., she sealed the tapes for decades and set about rewriting her own marriage in real time. Listen to those recordings, released to the public at last in 2011, and you meet a Jacqueline Kennedy performing the role of a lifetime. Vanished, the affairs. Vanished, the emotional Siberia of the White House years, the near divorce after Arabella, the 3 days her husband spent choosing a yacht over her grief. In their place sits a demure 1950s wife who insists she drew all her opinions straight from her husband and recalls a union of perfect accord, two people who, in her careful telling, agreed on absolutely everything under the sun. The performance ran flawless from the first minute to the last. She cast herself as a docile helpmeet who lived only to reflect her husband's brilliance, a portrait so at odds with the sharp, watchful, iron-spined woman her friends knew that it amounts to fiction with footnotes. Historians read the Schlesinger tapes now not as marital history at all, but as a widow's final campaign, waged with the same instinct for image that carried her through Paris and Parkland and Dealey Plaza. She protected the affairs into silence and buried the near divorce in oblivion. What she manufactured instead outlasted every rival account and hardened over 60 years into the story a whole nation still tells itself about a marriage almost nobody actually watched from the inside. She lied, and she lied like an artist. Understand what she pulled off, and the entire story flips on its head. The woman we cast as the passive victim of the Kennedy machine, the wronged wife, the decorative first lady, stage managed the single most successful act of self-mythology in American political history. Her husband's men ran the country, Jackie ran his legend, and hers proved the more durable enterprise by a wide margin. His affairs faded into footnotes. The stillbirths and the surgeries and the humiliations dissolved into a soft shimmer of pillbox hats and cello music, exactly as she engineered it. So here sits the real love story, and it looks nothing like the postcard. Not a fairy tale of a golden couple, but the grinding, grieving, occasionally vicious marriage of two proud people who wounded each other for a decade and reached toward tenderness only once death began circling the house. She survived his betrayals. Jackie survived his surgeries, the small coffins of two of her children, and the murder of her husband while she knelt close enough to catch the blood on her hands. Then she pulled off the one thing the almighty Kennedy machine never could. She rewrote history, and she carved her version so deep that 60 years on, most of the world still recites hers instead of the facts. Camelot never existed as anything more than a word a widow borrowed from a musical and welded onto the bloodiest chapter of her life, and Jackie built it anyway, brick by brick, out of the wreckage of the worst thing that ever happened to her. Judge the marriage, however harshly the full record invites, and weigh every private betrayal and cold calculation against the myth she manufactured out of them. The woman closed the deal. America builds its myths around men who die young, then quietly hands the maintenance contract to whichever woman still stands in the room after the shooting stops. Somebody keeps the flame lit, somebody answers the letters, dedicates the libraries, raises the children who look too much like their father, and smiles at the cameras every June on the anniversary of the worst night of her life. For 56 years that somebody carried the name Ethel Kennedy, and she carried it with a ferocity that unsettled anybody expecting a widow to fade politely into the wallpaper. You know the outline already. A hotel kitchen in Los Angeles, a busboy's rosary pressed into a dying man's palm, a country losing its second Kennedy in 5 years, while the television cameras rolled straight through the night. Bobby died on June 6, 1968. at 42. Ethel, 40 years old and pregnant with their 11th child, buried him at Arlington and then lived another 56 years without ever seriously entertaining another man. Rory arrived that December and never met her father. One question trails Ethel through every Kennedy biography ever printed, and it keeps trailing her past the funeral, past the medal ceremony, past her own death in 2024 at the age of 96. Why stay? Bobby cheated, or the world spent 6 decades insisting he cheated, and the rumors ran hot enough to blister the paint off a cathedral door. She never divorced him, never remarried, never permitted so much as a photograph, hinting at a second act. The lazy answer involves money, and the lazy answer collapses on contact. Ethel Skakel walked into that marriage carrying a coal and coke fortune of her own, which eliminates the single motive explaining most political wives of her generation. Nobody bought her silence because nobody ever needed to. So the answer lives somewhere stranger, inside a pre-Vatican II catechism and inside the example of a father-in-law who treated his wedding vows as a parking suggestion. Pull the thing apart and you find something harder than loyalty. You find a woman who decided, sometime during the summer of 1968, that she would rather become a monument than remain a person. Ethel Skakel arrived on April 11, 1928, into the kind of money that never announces itself because it never needs to. Her father, George, built the Great Lakes Carbon Corporation out of nothing, a coal and coke fortune assembled by a man who understood that America would burn whatever anybody sold it. The Skakels owned 31 rooms in Greenwich, Connecticut. Old Yankee Greenwich looked at them and sniffed because the Skakels prayed Catholic, talked loud, and reeked of new money. Anne Brannock ran that house. A physically imposing woman with a temper and a rosary, she poured Catholic doctrine into her children at a pressure that left permanent grooves in every one of them. Her Catholicism predated the Second Vatican Council by decades, and inside it, hell functioned less as a metaphor and more as a street address. Mass every morning, confession as routine maintenance, sin tallied in an itemized ledger, the sacraments holding up an entire personality like load-bearing walls. Ethel absorbed every bit of it, and she absorbed it without the wobble of doubt that afflicts most believers by the age of 15. Faith never became a question for her, and it operated like plumbing, invisible, structural, catastrophic to remove. Every rule she would follow across the rest of her life, including the one binding her to a man the tabloids painted as a serial adulterer, traces straight back to that dining room in Greenwich and to the woman at the head of the table. She never left it behind, and she never once tried. Growing up, she ran boisterous and aggressively athletic, a girl treating physical risk as a personality trait rather than a hazard. Nobody in that house prized stillness. The Skakel children drove too fast, argued too loud, prayed too hard, and treated the family fortune as fuel rather than furniture, which produced a young woman who would walk into the most competitive clan in American politics and immediately outcompete them. That engine carried her directly into a family prizing exactly the same qualities, which explains why the Kennedys recognized her on sight as one of their own, and why Jacqueline Bouvier never quite would. December 1945, Mont-Tremblant, Quebec. A 17-year-old Ethel Skakel clattered down a ski slope and collided with the Kennedy family in the person of a 20-year-old Bobby who possessed all the charm of a clenched fist and none of his older brother's polish. He liked her sister. Pat Skakel, older and cooler and considerably less exhausting, held Bobby's attention first, and for a while the arrangement looked settled to everybody watching. That romance collapsed. Ethel waited, then moved, and by 1949 the two of them courted seriously enough that both families began the slow arithmetic of a merger between two enormous Catholic fortunes. Something almost comic sits at the origin of the most fanatically loyal marriage in American political history. The groom wanted the other sister. Nobody in 1950 laughed about it. They married on June 17th of that year at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Greenwich in front of a congregation that understood precisely what a Catholic sacrament costs and precisely how permanent it intends to remain. Everything in this story hangs on that last sentence. A Catholic marriage of 1950, performed properly in front of God and Greenwich, did not function as a contract either party could renegotiate once the terms turned unpleasant. It functioned as a metaphysical fact, and metaphysical facts survive bad behavior. Bobby could stray. The marriage would continue existing regardless, because in Ethel's theology, the marriage existed independently of whether either of them behaved well inside it. In 1956, Bobby and Ethel bought Hickory Hill, an estate in McLean, Virginia, from Jack and Jackie Kennedy, and within a few years, the property acquired a reputation biographers still reach for adjectives to describe. Chaos, mostly. Peter Collier and David Horowitz portray Ethel presiding over the place as a raucous, endlessly energetic mistress of ceremonies, which translates roughly to this: the house never once shut the hell up. Children everywhere. Dogs, horses, ponies, a menagerie in various stages of escape, and a swimming pool functioning as the estate's primary instrument of social policy. Ethel once shoved the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. into that pool fully clothed, and Schlesinger, a Pulitzer winner and a gentleman, climbed out dripping and rejoined the party without complaint. The anecdote survives because it explains her better than a paragraph of analysis ever could. She spent almost the entire marriage pregnant. 11 children between 1951 and 1968 works out to a pregnancy running through most of the calendar years of that marriage, carried by a woman who simultaneously worked the campaign trail like a field general. Jack's run in 1960, Bobby's Senate race, the presidential campaign of 1968, she attacked each one with the energy of somebody who resented sleep. Political wives of that era smiled and waved. Ethel hollered, argued, memorized precinct captains by name, and dragged strangers into conversations her husband found useful. And by 1963, the Kennedy operation counted her as an asset rather than an ornament. Hold the two women side by side. Jackie Kennedy read French novels and lowered her voice until powerful men leaned forward to catch it. Ethel bellowed across tennis courts and approached a formal dinner party as a contact sport. Evan Thomas and the family contemporaries who watched both of them up close described the difference as total. An introvert of refined stillness and an extrovert who treated silence as a personal failure. The family loved Jackie the way you love a painting. The family loved Ethel the way you love a sister who will drive you to the airport at 4 a.m. And that distinction would matter enormously after November of 1963. One of them, Bobby married. The other one, after Dallas, he could not stop calling. And that single unresolved fact kept several generations of Kennedy biographers in business for the next 60 years. The rumors began while Bobby still lived, and they metastasized the instant he stopped breathing. Marilyn Monroe occupies the center of nearly all of them, and the claim, in its most popular form, holds that the Attorney General of the United States conducted a sustained physical affair with the most photographed woman on Earth while simultaneously running the Justice Department. Larry Tye and Anthony Summers argue some version of yes. Donald Spoto argues no, and Spoto brings flight logs, documents proving that a sustained physical affair between Bobby Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe would require the man to occupy two places at once, repeatedly, across a span of months. Tye's careful version permits a single night. One encounter, nothing beyond it, a version fitting the surviving evidence far better than the alternative and selling considerably worse, which explains the shelf full of paperbacks insisting otherwise. The remainder of the Monroe material rests on FBI wiretap summaries nobody ever verified, and on anecdotes from Peter Lawford, whose relationship with the factual record could charitably qualify as recreational. Lawford drank, Lawford talked, and the tabloid economy of the 1970s paid him handsomely for both, because a dead Kennedy cannot sue and a dead actress cannot correct the transcript. See David Heyman push the story further, into Candace Bergen, then 20 years old, and into Lee Radziwill, Jackie's own sister. Historians reject both claims, and they reject them for a reason that ought to close the subject permanently. Heyman fabricated quotes, invented sources, and constructed interviews with people who never spoke to him. Nobody checks footnotes. His books sold beautifully. the damn things still circulate. And that exact mechanism explains how a fabrication turns into something your aunt repeats at Thanksgiving dinner. Claudine Longet, the singer, drifts through the rumor mill without a scrap of material evidence attached to her name. Strip away the fabrications, the unverified wiretaps, and Lawford, and something stubborn still remains, because the biographers who defend Bobby most vigorously concede the point anyway. The man possessed a roving eye. Whether that eye ever translated into sustained betrayal of his wife remains, after 6 decades of digging, by people motivated to find otherwise unresolved, and an unsatisfying answer occasionally happens to double as the accurate one. Understand why the rumors stuck. Because the mechanism matters more than any individual allegation. Dead men cannot sue. A murdered Kennedy generates demand for new material forever, and publishers pay for material, so a cottage industry grew up around the corpse and fed itself for 60 years on wiretap fragments, deathbed recollections, and the convenient testimony of drunks. Each new book cites the last one. Repetition manufactures a kind of counterfeit consensus, and the counterfeit passes as currency long after the mint burns down, which describes precisely what occurred to the reputation of Robert Francis Kennedy in the paperback racks of American airports. Ethel knew all of it. She lived inside the rumor decade after decade, watched it printed and reprinted, watched her own children read it in paperback, and never once cracked. Not a word to a reporter. No leaked diary, no bitter interview, no sympathetic profile placed by a family friend during the long stretch of years when she could burn her husband's reputation to the ground and collect thanks from half the country for doing it. November 1963 broke Bobby Kennedy in a way the public never fully saw. He stopped eating, wore his dead brother's overcoat, and disappeared into Greek tragedy the way other men disappear into liquor. And the only person on the planet occupying the same crater of grief answered to the name of his brother's widow. Jackie and Bobby found each other down in that hole. They stayed there for years, and nobody who watched it disputes the closeness. What the two of them did with that closeness splits the biographers cleanly. Evan Thomas reads the relationship as a trauma bond and nothing else, with Bobby stepping into the role of surrogate father to John and Caroline, a duty he performed until the night he died on a kitchen floor in Los Angeles. J. Randy Taraborelli reads it differently. Charles Spaulding, an old friend of Jack's, described Bobby and Jackie on a beach in Antigua, holding hands, reading Greek literature aloud to one another, which strikes you either as the most innocent image in this entire story or the least, depending entirely on what you carry into it. Ethel noticed. According to Jamie Auchincloss, quoted in Taraborelli's work, Ethel walked up to Jacqueline Kennedy and delivered a sentence with no wasted words in it. "Look, people are whispering about you and Bobby." She chose that verb carefully. Whispering carries no accusation and demands no denial, and it left Jackie holding a problem she could not solve without first conceding that the problem existed at all. Notice what Ethel did not do. No scene, no lawyers, no cold silence stretching across a decade of Thanksgivings. No public break with the woman the whole world watched climb across the trunk of a moving car in Dealey Plaza. Ethel confronted her, and then Ethel swallowed the thing whole. That capacity, seeing clearly and absorbing completely, describes the architecture of her entire marriage. And the architecture rested on 2 supports, one theological and one hereditary. Take the theology first, because modern audiences badly underrate how much weight a catechism used to carry. A Catholic of Ethel's generation, formed before the Second Vatican Council, loosened the joints of the whole structure, understood divorce not as a legal option, carrying a social penalty, but as a spiritual amputation. You did not divorce. Divorce sat outside the range of available human actions, because the sacrament of marriage created something existing independently of your preferences, and destroying it constituted a mortal sin, which meant hell, which meant forever. Modern viewers hear the phrase mortal sin and file it under metaphor. Ethel Skakel Kennedy filed it under geography, and her mother installed that particular map inside her skull before she turned 6 years old. No version of this woman ever consults a divorce attorney. Bobby could keep a mistress on every floor of the Justice Department, And Ethel would still walk into St. Mary's on Sunday morning, kneel, and understand herself as married in a way no lawyer in Connecticut could touch. The vow bound her to God rather than to her husband's behavior. That distinction sits at the center of everything. Her marriage never depended on Bobby's fidelity because the sacrament never depended on Bobby's fidelity, and a promise to the Almighty includes no escape clause triggered by a Hollywood actress. Cruel arrangement? Ask any woman who lived beneath one, and she will describe a cage furnished in excellent taste. Ethel herself would reject the word cruel outright, since in her own accounting, she received the better end of the bargain. A sacrament no scandal could dissolve, a marriage outliving the man, and a husband she intended to keep on the far side of death itself. Theology explains why Ethel would not leave, and the Kennedy family explains why she never expected to want to. Larry Tye put the family's operating principle about as plainly as a biographer can, noting that no tradition of monogamy existed in the Kennedy clan, an observation he intended as flat description rather than scandal. Read the line as a job description rather than an insult. Joseph P. Kennedy, Sr., conducted his affairs with a brazenness bordering on performance art, keeping Gloria Swanson close enough to the family that Rose entertained the woman socially. Rose absorbed it. She prayed, traveled, cataloged her children's shoe sizes on index cards, and held the entire operation upright while her husband did as he pleased. And when the stroke of 1961 erased Joe's speech, she sat beside him anyway. The two of them sealed inside a marriage functioning like a corporation, with a hostile board and no exit provision. That model landed in front of Ethel Skakel in 1950, fully assembled, instructions included. Tye argues she walked in with her eyes open, and the argument holds, because nobody who spent 5 minutes near Hyannisport in 1949 missed what the men of that family considered normal behavior. Wives of mid-century political elites operated under a standing instruction: tolerate it quietly, protect the campaign, protect the children, and above all, protect the man, who carried the family's claim on the future while she carried its claim on respectability. Nothing about the arrangement struck her as unusual, and nothing about it struck Rose Kennedy as unusual either, which explains the eerie continuity between the two matriarchs. Both women outlived their husbands by decades. Both converted grief into institutional work. Both refused every invitation to complain publicly about the men they buried. And both understood the family name as a possession, requiring maintenance rather than a description of anything true. Rose died in 1995 at the age of 104, the longest-serving guardian of the Kennedy legend, until her daughter-in-law overtook her in stamina, if never quite in years. Ethel outperformed the instruction. Devotion, in her case, arrived without qualification, and biographers reaching for a word to describe it usually land on something uncomfortably close to fanatical. She protected Bobby's political climb with a fierceness that alarmed his own staff, threw herself into the job of guardian, and treated any threat to his ascent as a personal insult requiring a personal response. Infidelity never threatened that job. Divorce would annihilate it. June 5th, 1968. The Ambassador Hotel, Los Angeles. Bobby won California, cut through the kitchen pantry because the crowd out front pressed too thick to cross, and Ciaran stepped forward with a .22 caliber revolver. Ethel knelt on the concrete while a busboy named Juan Romero pressed rosary beads into the palm of a dying man, and at 1:44 in the morning on June 6th, the surgeons quit trying. She turned 40 that April, pregnant with the 11th child. She rode the funeral train from New York to Washington, past crowds standing on the track ballast in their church clothes, buried her husband at Arlington beside his brother, and then, on December 12th, delivered a daughter named Rory, who would spend an entire life meeting strangers, eager to describe a father she never saw. Widowhood opened somewhere in that summer. Ethel would ultimately spend more years as Bobby's widow than she ever spent knowing him alive. Widows remarry. Widows of 40, with money, with fame, with an address book containing every powerful man in the Northern Hemisphere, remarry constantly, and nobody thinks less of them, least of all the church, which permits it explicitly and always did. Canon law poses no obstacle whatsoever. Death dissolves the marriage bond, the widow walks free, and a priest will cheerfully perform the second wedding with the first husband's photograph propped on the mantelpiece behind him. Consider the woman in the next chair at Bobby's funeral. Inside 5 months of that funeral, Jacqueline Kennedy married Aristotle Onassis on a Greek island, traded the Kennedy name for a shipping fortune, and absorbed the resulting fury of Catholic America without visible damage. Jacqueline watched her sister-in-law do it, then declined the identical permission for the next 56 years. Andy Williams escorted her to events across much of that period. Tabloids performed the arithmetic tabloids always perform, and both parties denied any romance flatly, consistently, and until the end of their lives, calling the friendship a companionship born of mutual grief. Williams spent much of that same stretch married to Claudine Longet, the singer whose name the rumor mill once attached to Bobby, a coincidence a novelist would delete for straining credulity. In 1991, a reporter from People finally put the question to her directly, asking why a woman widowed at 40 never took a second husband across the 23 years since. She answered without hesitation, "How could I possibly do that with Bobby looking down from heaven? That would be adultery." Read the sentence slowly. She did not describe herself as unwilling or heartbroken or loyal or any of the other adjectives the culture hands to widows for free. She called a second marriage adultery, and adultery requires, as a plain matter of grammar, a first marriage still in force, which means Ethel Kennedy considered herself married to a man 23 years in the ground. The other line she offered that year lands harder still. She would wake in the morning and picture Bobby happy in heaven, reunited with Jack, the two brothers together, up there in exactly the way they lived together down here. That belief carried her through the first year, then through the next 55. Remarriage never presented itself as a temptation demanding resistance. Remarriage presented itself as a category error, a proposal roughly as coherent as asking a woman to marry the husband she already possessed. Biographers arrive at the same place from a different road. Ethel understood herself as the keeper of Robert Kennedy's flame rather than an available woman of 40, and a flame requires a keeper belonging to nobody else, particularly across the decades when the Kennedy legend performed real political work for real Kennedy candidates. A widow can remarry, a monument stays exactly where somebody put it, decade after decade, until the crowd stop coming and the story finishes telling itself. She founded the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial within months of the funeral, an organization surviving today under the name Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, and she poured 5 decades of unspent energy into it. Work functioned as ballast. She needed the ballast because the next 50 years arrived, carrying a bill that no amount of faith fully covers. In 1984, her 4th child, David, died of a drug overdose at 28. 13 years later, Michael, her 6th, died in a skiing accident at 39, and the family absorbed a second funeral for a son who never reached 40. Her daughter-in-law, Mary Richardson Kennedy, died by suicide in 2012. 7 years after that, her 22-year-old granddaughter, Saoirse, died of an accidental overdose, and Ethel, then 91, walked behind another coffin. Count the arithmetic across one life. A husband shot at 42, a brother-in-law shot at 46, 2 sons buried, a daughter-in-law lost, a granddaughter lost. Faith stayed. She attended Mass, prayed for all of them, and continued speaking about Bobby in the present tense, as though the man occupied the next room rather than a plot of Virginia grass. Nobody in the family reports ever seeing her waver. Not once, not for an afternoon. Whether that constitutes strength or a magnificent refusal to look directly at anything remains, like most questions about Ethel Kennedy, a matter of what you already believe about her. On November 24, 2014, Barack Obama hung the Presidential Medal of Freedom around her neck. She stood in the East Room at 86, surrounded by surviving children, accepting the country's highest civilian honor for human rights work that began the week her husband died. Bobby never saw a minute of it. Ethel Skakel Kennedy died on October 10, 2024, at the age of 96, 56 years and 4 months after the pantry at the Ambassador. Strip the story down to its frame. A woman married a man in 1950 under a theology treating the vow as permanent, discovered that her husband attracted rumors the way a lightning rod attracts lightning, and declined to leave because leaving never appeared anywhere on the list of things a person in her position could do. Then somebody shot him. She stayed married anyway, for 56 years, to a husband she believed watched her from somewhere above Virginia, and she stayed married with such conviction that the mere question of remarriage struck her as a question about adultery. Call it faith, call it stubbornness, a failure of imagination, or the final surviving expression of a Catholic world that Vatican II dismantled while she looked the other way. Ethel would reject every one of those labels and pick up a tennis racket. Whatever the name, the fact holds, she outlasted the rumors, outlasted the biographers who profited from them, outlasted the fabricator who invented the worst of them, and outlasted nearly everybody who ever worked up the nerve to ask her the question directly. The Kennedys built their myth out of murdered men. That myth held decade after decade because a woman in McLean, Virginia, refused to let a single crack open in the story, granted no interview undercutting it, and permitted no photograph of herself on the arm of a man who could not possibly measure up to a ghost. Someone must keep the flame lit. She kept it for 56 years, 4 months, and 4 days, and then she put it down. Bobby lived 42 years. Ethel spent longer as Bobby's widow than Bobby spent alive, and she never once described that arrangement as a sacrifice because in her understanding of the universe, nothing about it required one. 18 years of marriage, 56 years of widowhood, and not one of them spent looking for a replacement. America swore it would never build a monarchy, then built one anyway. We took a family from Massachusetts, wrapped them in a word borrowed from a Broadway musical, and decided their weddings and their funerals belonged to all of us. A dynasty like that runs on faces. It needs men to give speeches and women to stand near the men, beautiful and composed, smiling into 1,000 flashbulbs while the country decides they inhabit a fairy tale. Joan Kennedy played that part for almost 25 years. Blonde, soft-spoken, trained since girlhood at the piano, she looked precisely like the wife the Kennedy operation wanted the public to see. A colder story moved behind that composed face, one of 3 pregnancies that ended almost before they began, of a young woman who drowned while Joan carried a child she would also lose, of a disease that unspooled her in public while a whole nation traded her name as a punchline. You think you already know how this goes. The drunk wife, the cheating senator, the pale blonde blurred in the background of more famous people. What actually happened to Joan runs harder and stranger than the tabloid shorthand, and the strangest part lies in how much of the damage arrived wearing the face of family loyalty. This is a story about one woman standing against an institution that treated her as a prop, and institutions almost always win those fights. They won most of this one. What follows charts every place the machine took something from her, and the one late chapter where she reached back and pried a life of her own out of its hands. She met him at a gymnasium. The detail sounds almost too small and comic for the wreckage it would grow into. In October of 1957, Edward Moore Kennedy, the youngest of the clan and the one everybody underestimated, turned up to dedicate a new gym building at Manhattanville College of the Sacred Heart, and a senior named Joan Bennett caught his eye somewhere between the speeches and the ribbon. She studied there, a Bronxville girl raised Catholic and comfortable, the kind of young woman who could sit down at a keyboard and silence a room. That piano mattered more than anyone around her understood at the time. Music belonged to Joan the way politics belonged to the Kennedys, a first language learned in childhood, and for the rest of her life it stayed the one country where nobody outranked her. She walked into that gymnasium as a musician who happened to catch a senator's brother. She walked out of the next 25 years as a footnote to his ambition. They married just over a year later on the 29th of November, 1958, inside St. Joseph's Church in Bronxville. To the guests, it looked like a straightforward society wedding between a handsome heir and a lovely young pianist, 2 attractive Catholics from good families doing the expected thing at the expected time. The photographs came out beautifully. Underneath that, other machinery hummed. Some biographers have argued that the whole courtship ran on a schedule set by the family patriarch, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., who wanted his sons paired off and photographed and respectable, before John Kennedy's 1958 Senate re-election. A pretty wife on Ted's arm rounded out the family portrait at exactly the right moment for the cameras, and Joseph Sr. rarely left a moment like that to chance. Other historians push back, pointing out that a courtship of roughly a year counted as ordinary for wealthy Catholic families of the era, and that reading the whole thing as a corporate merger flattens two young people who genuinely liked each other. Both things can sit in the same room. Joan could have loved him and still walked into a marriage whose terms strangers drafted before she ever arrived. Consider what she married into at 22. Not a husband, but a firm. The Kennedys ran on a family logic older than any of the children, engineered by a father who treated public life as a business with heirs, and every marriage inside it functioned as a merger with expectations attached. Joan brought a music degree and a gentle temperament to a household that valued neither. She would spend 2 decades discovering exactly how little room that household kept for a woman who could not turn grief into a campaign asset. The job arrived before she understood it as a job. Within a couple of years, she carried the Kennedy name, and living as a Kennedy woman in that decade meant a specific unpaid career with brutal performance reviews and no exit interview. Her first child, Cara, arrived on the 27th of February, 1960. Weeks after giving birth, Joan pulled herself out of the recovery bed and onto the campaign trail for her brother-in-law's run at the presidency, shaking hands in coffee klatches and church basements while her body still healed. The photographs from that period sell a certain fantasy. Golden couple, golden family, a woman who seemed born for the flashbulbs. Nobody asked whether she wanted the job. The Kennedy operation ran its women like surrogates on a schedule, dispatched to whichever district needed a friendly face, and a new mother recovering from childbirth counted as no excuse to skip a stop. Joan smiled through it, because smiling through it defined the entire assignment. Her exhaustion stayed off the record, and the polling data never once asked how she felt. The private version ran a different direction entirely. Joan came into the family from outside its bloodline and outside its temperature, and the Kennedy household ran hot, competitive, and merciless in a way no upbringing prepared her to survive. She measured herself against Jacqueline, who could disarm a French president in his own language, and against Ethel, who produced children and campaign energy at an athletic clip that left everyone else winded. Against those two, Joan came away convinced she ranked as the weak link, the soft one, the sister-in-law who could play Chopin but could not play the family. Marcia Chellis, who later worked closely with her and wrote about those years, described a woman drowning in a private conviction that she did not belong, that the family had cast her in a role she could never grow into. The isolation hid behind good posture and a nice dress. Nobody photographs loneliness. Then the family started to die, and the dying changed everything anyone asked of her. An assassin killed John Kennedy in Dallas in 1963. 5 years later, another gunman killed Robert in the kitchen of a Los Angeles hotel, and both older brothers who once commanded the world's attention lay dead. The youngest, the one nobody ever planned to lean on, inherited the entire weight of the name. Ted became the surrogate father to 13 fatherless children, Caroline and John Jr. from Jack's side, and the 11 children Robert left behind, a classroom's worth of grief that now looked to him for a father's steadiness. A man barely into his 30s took on a role built for a patriarch, and the family expected his wife to steady the whole trembling structure from beside him. While the country mourned in public, Joan lost children in private. She miscarried in 1963, and again in 1964, 2 griefs the Kennedy publicity apparatus found no use for and never mentioned to anyone. No space existed in the machine for a wife who needed rest or comfort, only for a wife who could stand on a platform and wave. Tara Borelli's account puts the pressure plainly. After Robert's death in 1968, the family's political engine began treating Ted as the presumptive next president and Joan as the presumptive next first lady, and it demanded a flawless performance from a woman quietly coming apart under the load. She trained as a pianist, and they cast her as a monument. Think about what that title threatened to cost her. First Lady of the United States, a role the machine now treated as her destiny, whether she wanted it or not, promising a lifetime of the exact scrutiny already breaking her in smaller doses. She never applied for the position. The family drafted her into it, measured her against the memory of Jacqueline in the same breath, and left her to absorb the fear that she would fail on the largest stage the country owned. A woman terrified of a dinner party found herself handed a coronation on layaway. Every marriage owns a night it never recovers from. Joan's landed on the 18th of July, 1969, on a small island off Martha's Vineyard, and she never even stood on the ground where it happened. Around 11:15 that night, Ted Kennedy drove a car off a narrow bridge on Chappaquiddick Island. His passenger, Mary Jo Kopechne, 28 years old, had given years of her young life to Robert Kennedy's cause and survived him only to drown in the back of his brother's car. The vehicle flipped into the water, and Ted climbed out. Mary Jo did not. He left the scene and never called the police for roughly 10 hours, walking in to tell his story near 10 the following morning, by which time a diver had already pulled the young woman's body from the submerged wreck. A family in Pennsylvania started planning a funeral for a daughter who did nothing wrong except climb into the wrong car on the wrong night. Sit with the arithmetic of those 10 hours. A car plunged into the water before midnight, and a United States senator waited until mid-morning to tell anyone in a uniform the gap between the crash and the confession long enough for a whole rescue to have happened and never did. The Edgartown police recorded the timeline, and the country drew its own conclusions. And somewhere in Virginia, a pregnant woman on doctor-ordered bed rest watched the man she married become the most notorious name in America overnight. Joan learned about it while pregnant and confined to strict bed rest, ordered there precisely because 2 earlier pregnancies ended in loss. Her doctors wanted her still and calm while the family wanted her standing. She stood. On the 22nd of July, she attended Mary Jo Kopechne's funeral, a pregnant woman under medical orders to stay in bed, sent instead to a graveside to help her husband resemble a grieving friend rather than a man under investigation. 3 days later, on the 25th, she appeared at his side in a courtroom while Ted pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of an accident and collected a suspended sentence. The cameras caught the loyal wife, but they missed what it cost the body carrying that loyalty. In August of 1969, within weeks of the funeral and the courtroom, and the humiliation broadcast into every American home, Joan lost the pregnancy. Her third. Biographers who disagree about almost everything else agree about this sequence, the drowning and the forced performances and the collapse that followed, as the point where both the marriage and the woman inside it broke past repair. A young woman lay dead in the ground. A wife lost the child that the family pulled her from her sickbed. To protect a scandal she played no part in creating. And the family called it loyalty and moved on to damage control. If you're still with Joan this far in, you already see what the cameras refuse to. Do her the kindness the family never managed, subscribe, and stay to the end. The worst of what they buried comes next, and she earned an audience that watches all of it. A later version of Ted Kennedy sands him down into the lion of the Senate. That version leaves out the man Joan actually married. Around Washington, his infidelity counted as less a rumor than a fixed feature of the weather. His reputation as a womanizer trailed him through the Senate for decades, an open secret traded among reporters and staffers who mostly agreed not to print it. Joan lived inside that secret, with the doors locked from the outside. The whispering did its work on a woman already convinced she fell short, confirming her worst belief about herself with every rumored name and every knowing look across a party. Careful sourcing matters here, and honesty demands it. The tabloid press speculated about the specific women endlessly, and loyal Senate staff spent years shielding the details, so most named claims about particular individuals stay unverified to this day. No serious account disputes the pattern itself, and the chronic betrayal happened even where the individual names dissolve into gossip. Joan did not need the names to feel the arrangement. She needed a marriage, and instead she rehearsed a performance for people who already knew the show meant nothing. Live inside that for a decade and count the cost. Every Washington dinner turned into an exam she could fail without warning. Every friendly hostess a potential rival, every headline a chance for the world to learn something about her own husband before she did. A marriage runs on trust the way an engine runs on oil. And Jones ran bone dry for years while the family insisted, for the cameras, that the machine hummed along fine. The strain drained somewhere. It usually pooled in a glass. Here, most tellings turn cruel, and the honest one refuses to. Joan drank. By the early 1970s, the drinking stopped hiding, and on the 9th of October, 1974, it stepped straight into the public record when police arrested her for drunk driving after a minor collision in McLean, Virginia. The press ran its headline. The jokes wrote themselves, and the country that crowned her a princess a decade earlier now passed around a punchline: the boozy Kennedy wife. Good for a laugh at somebody else's dinner table. The lazy story claims Ted drove her to drink. That version runs both too simple and too flattering to everyone except Joan. His behavior and the constant terror of what people called the Kennedy curse worked at real accelerants, the kind of environment that could push a vulnerable person toward the bottle and pin her there for years. But Joan also carried a genetic loading for the disease, inherited down a family line where her own mother fought alcoholism before her. Reducing her illness to a husband's sins erases the medical condition she actually fought, and it steals from her the one thing the machine never granted her: ownership of her own life. She seized that ownership in the most unexpected way available. In 1978, instead of hiding, Joan sat down with McCall's magazine and named her alcoholism out loud, on the record, under her own name. No political wife of that era spoke like that. Addiction meant shame and silence, a thing families buried in a back bedroom. And here sat a Kennedy discussing it in plain sentences years before the Betty Ford Center gave the whole country permission to say the word. The woman everyone wrote off as the weak one attempted something none of the strong ones dared try. She stopped performing and started confessing, and in doing so, she outpaced an entire culture that had not yet caught up to her. Weigh that against the caricature for a second. The joke of the era pictured a hopeless society, drunk, useless, and embarrassing, and the woman inside the joke chose to walk toward the shame instead of away from it. She turned her own worst chapter into something other women could read and recognize. A political spouse admitting to alcoholism in a national magazine in 1978 took a kind of nerve the Kennedy men, with all their trained bravery, never once demonstrated about their own failures. She earned no monument for it. Sobriety arrived instead, and with it, she handed a lot of frightened people a sentence they could finally say out loud. For once, she moved first. In 1978, the couple formally separated, and Joan tried the one move the family's script left no page for. She abandoned Hyannisport and the whole apparatus and rented an apartment of her own in Boston, alone, so she could get sober on her own terms in a city where nobody staged a photograph on her front step. Then she returned to school. During the separation, Joan enrolled in graduate study and in 1981 earned a master's degree in education from Lesley College, an accomplishment no press office arranged and no campaign required. Think about the distance in that. A woman the country shrank to a caption sat in ordinary classrooms beside students half her age, completed the work under her own steam, and walked out holding a degree that belonged to her and to nobody named Kennedy. That degree carried no political value whatsoever, which is precisely why it stayed hers. The family never needed an educated Joan, and the cameras never asked for one. She pursued the thing anyway, in a Boston classroom far from Hyannisport, for the private satisfaction of finishing something the machine took no interest in. A woman handed a coronation on layaway a decade earlier chose, in the end, a diploma she paid for herself. The machine, predictably, came calling one more time. When Ted mounted his 1980 Democratic primary challenge against the sitting president, Jimmy Carter, the estranged couple reunited for the cameras across 1979 and 1980, standing shoulder to shoulder in the old familiar pose, so voters would see a marriage instead of a wreckage. She played the part again. The campaign wanted the united front, and Joan, sober now and rebuilding, delivered one last performance before she finished performing for good. The ending came quietly, which meant it came sealed. In 1981, the Kennedys announced their intention to divorce, and a court dissolved the marriage in 1982, closing a partnership that outlasted more than 2 decades and nearly everyone who arranged it. A myth attached itself to the split almost immediately, and it deserves correcting. People love to call this the first divorce in the senior generation of the Kennedy clan, a crack in the granite of a famously Catholic family. That claim misses the record. Ted's sister, Patricia Kennedy Lawford, already divorced back in February of 1966. Joan's divorce broke a narrower record. It counted as the first divorce among the Kennedy brothers themselves, the men who carried the political name into elections, which explains why it landed so much harder in the public imagination than Patricia's ever did. The terms vanished into a vault. A court in Barnstable County, Massachusetts, sealed the settlement permanently, and it stayed sealed, which has never once stopped the press from repeating the reported numbers as if someone somewhere had carved them into stone. Press accounts have long claimed Joan walked away with around $4 million, her Boston apartment, and a house in Hyannisport. Treat those figures the way the record demands. Newspapers reported them widely and confirmed them not at all, guessing at documents no reporter ever actually read. Even her exit from the family stayed hidden behind Kennedy soundproofing. The one document that might tell us what 2.5 decades of that marriage cost her in dollars remains locked in a Massachusetts courthouse, and the estimates everyone quotes amount to educated tabloid arithmetic. She married in front of 1,000 cameras and divorced behind a wall the public never scaled. The divorce handed her no tidy, happy ending, and pretending otherwise would betray the whole point of telling this honestly. Joan built a real life anyway. She reclaimed it in the spaces the family never let her occupy, publishing a book called The Joy of Classical Music in 1992 and performing again as a pianist, returning to the identity she carried into that gymnasium back in 1957 before the name swallowed it whole. The disease, though, never fully released her. Her alcoholism stayed a lifelong fight, and in July of 2004 and again in April of 2005, her 3 children, Kara, Ted Jr., and Patrick, stepped in and assumed temporary legal guardianship to force her into treatment after doctors hospitalized her with a concussion following a collapse alone on a Boston sidewalk. Picture the reversal in that. The 3 children who survived those years grew up and carried her, standing in a probate court to rescue the mother the family once dragged from a sickbed to rescue their father's reputation. There is no clean moral to file that under. A woman who spent her whole marriage propping up other people ended those decades needing her own children to prop her up. And they did it in court on the record because the alternative meant watching her die on a pavement. The guardianship humiliated her in exactly the way the old machine used to, except this time the people applying the pressure loved her and wanted her alive. That distinction matters more than it looks. Nobody put a camera on it. She lived out her last years quietly in Boston. The flashbulbs finally left her alone. Joan Bennett Kennedy died on the 8th of October, 2025, at the age of 89, from complications of dementia, having outlasted the husband, the myth, and most of the people who ever tried to tell her who she could be. We built a monarchy we swore we would never build, and monarchies eat their women quietly. They keep it out of the coronation footage. They preserve the ceremony and hide the cost, and the cost almost always carries a woman's name written under a nice dress in a photograph nobody looks at twice. The family cast Joan Kennedy as scenery. They positioned her as the pretty accessory to a great man's ascent, the smiling blonde at the edge of the frame. And for a long time, the country happily left her there, first as an ornament and later as a joke. The record shows something the frame never could. She grieved 3 lost children while a nation watched a scandal instead. She stood in a courtroom and at a graveside while her own body broke. A husband whose sins the whole Capitol agreed to bury betrayed her in public and let her take the laughter for it. And then, without a campaign strategist or a press release or a single person telling her she could, she attempted the hardest things in this entire story on her own. She named her disease out loud when the culture forbade naming it. She left the most powerful family in America and rented an apartment where nobody watched. In her 40s, she sat in a classroom and earned a degree carrying her own name, and she returned to the piano bench they pulled her away from before any of them ever heard of her. The marriage ran worse than you think, yes. Worse in the miscarriages the cameras never mentioned, worse in the drowning that reached her through a bedroom wall, worse in the loyalty that amounted to a leash held by people who called it love. But the woman proved stronger than the story ever allowed. They wrote her as the weak one. She outran the myth, buried the caricature, and walked out the far side of all of it as the only Kennedy of her generation who ever stood up in daylight and claimed her own plain story. History barely remembers the men in this family for what they built and what they broke. It barely remembers Joan at all, and when it does, it reaches for the drunk wife caption first. Correct the record while you can. She endured what would have flattened most of the people who mocked her. She named her own worst truth on a national stage when nobody required it, and she rebuilt a life in the one place the Kennedy name held no currency. Weak describes none of that, only the people who needed her silent. The one they called the weak link outlived the marriage, the scandal, and the man. America swears it doesn't do royalty. We fought an entire war to escape crowns, and then we spent the next 200 years inventing our own monarchs anyway, because a country apparently cannot survive on tax law and interstate highways alone. It needs a myth. Hollywood minted screen gods, Nashville minted outlaws, and one family from Massachusetts ascended into something larger than both of those combined. American royalty, capital A, capital R. In the autumn of 1996, that royalty machine produced its masterpiece, one single photograph. A man in a dark suit bows over the hand of a woman in white silk on the steps of a tiny wooden chapel, and he kisses that hand like a knight from a storybook nobody actually finished as a kid. The image ran on the cover of Time, then on the cover of People, then across every surface on the planet capable of holding ink. Within weeks, the Western world settled on its story. The Prince of America takes a beautiful, reluctant commoner as his bride, and the fairy tale, this country lost in 1963, returns at last, gift-wrapped and mercifully intact. That photograph launched the most successful LI in modern celebrity history, or rather two lies, sold back-to-back to the same customers. Lie number one arrived in 1996, the effortless storybook romance. Lie number two arrived after July 1999, a doomed, toxic, drug-soaked disaster of a marriage, supposedly weeks from divorce when the plane dropped into the sea. Both versions moved magazines by the truckload, and both versions collapse the moment you set them beside the actual record. What the federal investigators, the court of record newspapers, and the people who actually stood inside that Tribeca loft describe is stranger than either myth, sadder than either myth, and, in its own battered way, better. This is the story of Carolyn Bessette and John F. Kennedy Jr., and fair warning, the villain here is partly us, the audience, the customers who bought every single version they printed. Pour a coffee before we start, because this one leaves a bruise. Carolyn Bessette entered the world on January 7, 1966, in White Plains, New York, the daughter of William Bessette and Ann Messina, and nothing in the paperwork hinted at a future princess. Her parents divorced. Her mother remarried an orthopedic surgeon named Richard Freeman and moved the family to Greenwich, Connecticut, the kind of town where the lawns look vacuumed and the hedges apologize for growing. School told you plenty about who she'd become. 2 years at Greenwich High, the public school, and then, according to her biographer, The social life started lapping the academics badly enough that her mother transferred her to St. Mary's, a private Catholic school for junior and senior year. She graduated in 1983, headed to Boston University, and took 4.5 unhurried years to finish a degree in elementary education, walking out in January 1988 with a diploma designed for teaching third graders, not for surviving the most aggressive press pack on earth. Then came Calvin Klein, and this part of her life deserves real respect. Carolyn started on the sales floor of a Calvin Klein store in Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts, which is a polite way of saying she folded clothes at a shopping center outside Boston. From there, she transferred to the Manhattan flagship showroom, moved into celebrity sales and public relations, dressed clients like Diane Sawyer and Annette Bening, coordinated major runway shows, and climbed all the way to director of show production by the time she walked out the door in spring 1996. Colleagues describe her as decisive, hardworking, and stylistically brilliant, a woman who never once traded on social connections to climb. She earned that building floor by floor, and she ran those rooms really damn well. Hold on to that version of her, because a competing version exists. After her death, biographer Edward Klein repainted the same resume as the hunting record of a calculating social climber who targeted wealthy men across Boston and New York. Same woman, same years, two opposite stories, and that split runs through every chapter of her life like a crack across a windshield. Deciding which camp deserves your trust is the whole game here, so keep score as we go. You already know the family backstory, the Camelot years, Dallas, the whole aching national mythology, blah, blah, blah. None of it needs 40 more minutes from me, because this video isn't about the dynasty. It concerns one member of it, and by the early 1990s, John F. Kennedy Jr. carried the most famous surname in the country, an ambivalent relationship with the political future everyone kept assigning him, and a dating life that the American press treated as a public utility. Through the late 80s and into 1994, John maintained an on-again, off-again relationship with actress Daryl Hannah, thoroughly chronicled by People magazine and everybody else holding a camera. Somewhere in the middle of that, Carolyn appeared. And right here, the historical record does something wonderful. It falls apart completely. Christopher Anderson, one of the hostile biographers, claims John walked into the Calvin Klein showroom in 1992 for a custom suit fitting, and Carolyn deliberately orchestrated a seduction, like a Bond villain armed with a measuring tape. Friendlier sources contradict him and, delightfully, contradict each other. Some describe an industry event around 1992. Others point to mutual social circles in New York. At least one account involves a jogging encounter in Central Park, and the only point of agreement is that the actual dating started later. Nobody can even tell you how these two met. The most scrutinized couple of the decade, and the origin story is already fog. Where the credible accounts converge, the romance began quietly in 1993 or 1994, as the Hannah relationship dissolved in slow motion, and John did the pursuing. Carolyn turned him down at first. She knew exactly how the man lived, an active public figure with a well-earned reputation for never committing, and she wanted no part of the circus that came bolted to his last name. For the next 2 years, the relationship flickered on and off like a cheap porch light, driven by her hesitation about the Kennedy spotlight and his mounting obsession with launching George, his political magazine. And the more she backed away from the cameras, the more the cameras crowned her the most interesting woman in New York. February 25th, 1996, a Sunday. John and Carolyn walked their dog through Washington Square Park and fell into the kind of fight a couple that has when a proposal sits on the table and a life sentence of cameras comes attached to it. Voices rose. At one point, John tried to pull the engagement ring off her hand. She pushed him, and a National Enquirer photographer stood right there recording the entire meltdown, and the images ran nationwide within days. The hostile camp filed that afternoon away as Exhibit A of a mutually abusive, psychologically unstable relationship. And years later, Klein and Anderson would build whole chapters on top of it. People who actually knew the couple described something far less cinematic. A boiling point, produced by a fresh marriage proposal, a woman panicking about the loss of her private identity, and paparazzi surveillance already creeping into her daily routine. Notice the date, though, The world watched these two argue 7 months before it watched them marry, then collectively deleted the memory the second the wedding photo dropped. A fairy tale needs a clean first page, and the customers wanted a fairy tale. Now, we arrive at my favorite stretch of this entire story, because for one weekend in September 1996, two private citizens beat the whole American media industry at its own damn game. John and Carolyn planned their wedding the way other people plans a bank job. Their target date, September 21st, 1996. The location, the First African Baptist Church on Cumberland Island, Georgia, a tiny chapel on an island most Americans couldn't find with both hands and an atlas. No outside publicists, no professional wedding coordinators, no leaks of any kind. Planning stayed locked inside a brutally small circle. Just John, Carolyn, the hosts of the island's Grayfield Inn, and longtime Kennedy confidant Marta Scubin. Guests, somewhere between 35 and 40 of them, swore absolute secrecy and learned the destination only after their journey began, a level of operational discipline most intelligence agencies would study with envy. Not one photographer found them, zero. Not so much as a blurry long lens frame. Afterward, John released exactly one authorized image, shot by photographer Dennis Reggie, the hand kiss on the chapel steps. That single frame detonated worldwide, landing on the covers of Time and People by October, and the media assembled the myth on the spot. American royalty, the fairy tale prince weds the reluctant beauty. An entire storybook grew around one frozen second of film. Buried under the confetti sat a documented, deeply inconvenient fact. Carolyn spent the engagement severely apprehensive about precisely this outcome, about how marriage to this particular man would permanently rewrite her autonomy, and the people closest to her knew it. She watched the cage being built in real time. The fairy tale coverage overwrote her fear so thoroughly that the public never learned it existed. And then, the cage closed anyway, right on schedule. The honeymoon ended, the couple returned to their loft at 20 North Moore Street in Tribeca, and the photographers already ringed the block, not visiting but camped. Day one and the siege stood fully assembled. A permanent 24-hour encampment took root outside their front door and held its ground for the next 3 years. All of it preserved on contemporaneous video you can still watch today, though I don't recommend doing so on a full stomach. To understand those 3 years, you first need to understand the business model, and the business model ran on ugliness. A photograph of Carolyn calmly walking to work carried roughly the value of a coupon for expired yogurt. A photograph of Carolyn crying or snapping or shielding her face in visible distress could cover somebody's mortgage payment. So the photographers manufactured distress on an industrial schedule. They swarmed her on sidewalks, physically blocked her path, fired flashes point blank into her face, and shouted vulgar insults at her, all of it on tape and on the record, engineered purely to provoke a reaction they could sell by Friday. That isn't journalism. That is farming a human being for emotional produce. Her counter-strategy baffled everyone, because her counter-strategy consisted of nothing at all. Between 1996 and 1999, Carolyn gave 0 public interviews, hired 0 press agents, and staged 0 photo opportunities, a total refusal to perform that no figure of her prominence ever attempted in the modern era. She simply refused to feed the machine, and the machine denied its product, invented her personality instead. Because she lowered her head, wore sunglasses, and declined to smile while strangers screamed obscenities at her, the New York Post, Vanity Fair, and People reinterpreted visible distress as arrogance and branded her the Ice Queen. Read that sequence again slowly. An entire industry punished a woman in print for failing to enjoy her own harassment. Behind the loft door, the bill kept growing. Friends speaking on the record, Carol Radziwill, Rosemary Terenzio, and John Perry Barlow among them, described severe anxiety, hypervigilance, and creeping agoraphobic tendencies, a woman who increasingly felt imprisoned inside her own home. Radziwill's account frames the daily grind in military language. Every trip past her own front door required planning like a tactical operation. Every spontaneous instinct sanded away until nothing casual remained. Carolyn Bessette didn't change after the wedding. Her living conditions did, and the distinction would cost her reputation everything. While Carolyn fought the siege out front, 1998 bled into 1999, and every load-bearing wall in the couple's life cracked at the same time. Start with the magazine. George, John's political publication and the great bet of his professional life, hemorrhaged millions of dollars a year by mid-1999, advertising pages fell off a cliff, and Hachette Filipaki, the publisher bankrolling the whole operation, began performing the corporate equivalent of checking its watch and reaching for its coat. The Wall Street Journal reported Hachette re-evaluating the magazine's future in March 1999 in black and white for the entire industry to read. John spent the final months of his life scrambling for private investors or a replacement publishing partner, and by multiple accounts that stress refused to stay at the office. Then came the heavier weight. Anthony Radziwill, John's cousin and the closest friend of his entire life, lay dying of terminal sarcoma across 1998 and 1999, and nothing on earth could stop it. John and Carolyn poured themselves into supporting Anthony and his wife Carol, spending extensive time at their side, and friends described that sustained grief as a shared drain on the marriage, the slow kind of sorrow that never photographs well and never sold a single tabloid cover. Out on the newsstand, the headlines screamed about a cold marriage. Inside the marriage, two exhausted people quietly helped a family they loved face a death sentence. Her relationship with the wider Kennedy world followed the same pattern as everything else. Complicated in reality, cartoonish in print. Carolyn wanted nothing to do with the family's public machinery and skipped the big political summits at Hyannisport whenever she could, preferring small, intimate gatherings far away from any camera. The press read that distance is coldness toward the Klan, yet the documented record shows her building deep, genuine bonds exactly where they counted, with Anthony and Carol Radziwill and with John's sister Caroline, the people who wanted her company rather than her participation in a brand. She drew her line between the family and the franchise, and the hostile books never forgave her for it. Even John's private frustrations come down to us in two competing editions. The hostile books insist he felt trapped by a volatile wife who sabotaged his political future and alienated his family, a prisoner quietly plotting his escape. The people with actual access to him describe a different man carrying a different weight, frustrated by the financial collapse of George, gutted by Anthony's illness, and haunted most of all by his own failure to build his wife the private life he promised her. One version casts Carolyn as his problem, while the other casts her as the person he never stopped trying to protect. And only the second version rests on named sources. Under all of that pressure, yes, the marriage strained, and the couple did something almost aggressively sensible about it. They booked sessions with a Manhattan therapist. The hostile books framed that counseling as a catastrophic failure and proof of collapse, with Klein claiming the sessions broke down over Carolyn's alleged refusal to change. Historian Stephen Gillen, writing with access to John's own private papers, frames those same sessions as exactly what they appear to be: a working couple using a professional tool to manage friction between his public obligations and her desperate need for privacy. Couples who have quit on each other don't usually book the appointment, which brings us to the Stanhope Hotel, the crown jewel of the divorce mythology. In July 1999, Carolyn stayed at the Stanhope rather than at the Tribeca loft, and the hostile camp declared it a formal separation, a dead marriage living at two addresses. The documented explanations run considerably less operatic. The loft's air conditioning broke during a summer heat wave, and by her friends' accounts, Carolyn also used the hotel as a refuge from the paparazzi pressure cooker downstairs and from her grief over Anthony. John joined her there frequently. No separation papers existed anywhere. Neither spouse ever consulted a divorce attorney, and both Rosemarie Terenzio and Stephen Gillen reject the divorce claims flatly, categorically, and on the record. Every strand of the weeks from divorce storyline traces back to anonymous voices quoted by two authors carrying, let's say, decorated reputations for reliability problems. Of everything ever printed about Carolyn Bessette, one story deserves to be dragged into daylight and taken apart bolt by bolt: the cocaine story, which began as anonymous tabloid gossip across 1997 and 1998. the kind of sourcing that evaporates when you breathe on it. Klein and Anderson later hardened that gossip into printed fact, presenting her slender frame and visible distress as the signature of chronic addiction. The independent corroboration behind this claim totals 0, not thin 0. And unlike most celebrity rumors, this one eventually collided with hard science. After the crash, the National Transportation Safety Board ran post-mortem toxicology on the victims as part of its federal investigation, and the results came back completely negative for illicit drugs, in Carolyn and in John both. So the one accusation in this entire saga that a laboratory could actually test failed that test inside an official government report, and the books kept right on selling anyway. Her friends, meanwhile, explained the weight loss with something far less marketable. Stress strangled her appetite. Being hunted for 3 years will do that to a person. The affair story deserves identical treatment. In 2004, 5 years after she could no longer answer, former Calvin Klein underwear model Michael Bergen published a memoir claiming a sexual affair with Carolyn during her marriage. No independent witness, no correspondence, and no contemporaneous evidence of any kind supports the claim, while the man collecting the book advance held every financial incentive imaginable to make it. Her inner circle publicly called the story a fabrication, built for profit, and stated plainly that, while Bergen and Carolyn dated briefly before John, all romantic contact ended once she committed to him. One side of that dispute carried receipts and nothing to gain, while the other side carried a publishing contract. The weekend plan read simple on paper. On Friday evening, July 16, 1999, John would fly his Piper Saratoga out of Essex County Airport in Fairfield, New Jersey, drop Carolyn's older sister Lauren Bessette, a principal at Morgan Stanley at Martha's Vineyard, then continue on to Hyannisport for the Saturday wedding of his cousin Rory Kennedy. Carolyn arrived at that airport exhausted and grieving over Anthony, and by her friend's account, Lauren's presence aboard helped persuade her to make the trip at all. The Hostel authors later recast Lauren as a peacekeeper shuttling between a warring couple, and the record never supported them. Klein and Anderson pushed further still, claiming Carolyn refused to attend the wedding until the final hours because the marriage lay in ruins. Her friends tell it is smaller and sadder. Exhaustion owned her by then. Grief over Anthony pressed on everything. One more public appearance meant one more wall of lenses, and Hostel authors later repackaged that reluctance, born of pure fatigue, as proof of estrangement, one more entry in a long ledger of the same trick. About the delay, because the delay grew into its own poisonous myth. Tabloids claimed the departure slid into darkness because Carolyn burned the afternoon on a pedicure or shopping or a marathon argument with her husband. Federal investigators and first-hand accounts document what actually stalled the evening. John moved slowly because the cast from his recent ankle surgery came off only days earlier. His Manhattan meetings about rescuing George ran late. Friday rush hour traffic clogged the entire route out to New Jersey. And Lauren herself sat pinned at Morgan Stanley finishing financial transactions until late afternoon. Carolyn caused none of it, and the blame chased her anyway for the next 2 decades. The Saratoga lifted off into a hazy summer night and turned east over open water. Pilots understand what that combination can do. Over a dark ocean in haze with no visible horizon, the instruments in front of a pilot and the fluid inside his inner ear begin telling 2 different stories. And the body story always feels truer than the gauges. At approximately 9:41 p.m., the aircraft came down in the Atlantic 7 miles southwest of Martha's Vineyard. Investigators found no mechanical failure, no fire, no weather anomaly beyond that haze, and no alcohol or drugs in anyone aboard. The official finding of probable cause reads, the pilot's failure to maintain control of the airplane during a descent over water at night, which was a result of spatial disorientation. Factors in the accident were haze and the dark night. Darkness, haze, and a disoriented inner ear killed 3 people that night, and no curse, no cocaine, and no divorce lawyer played any part in it whatsoever. The wreckage held no scandal. The scandal came later, manufactured on dry land by people holding book contracts. Death created a vacuum, and the vacuum came with a business model attached. The dead cannot sue, cannot correct the record, and cannot sit for a rebuttal interview. So within months, the troubled marriage story hardened from tabloid whispers into accepted history. It slotted neatly into an existing product line, too. America spent decades buying the Kennedy curse, that mythology of a family doomed by fate itself, and a toxic, doomed marriage fit that franchise like a sequel nobody even needed to greenlight. Follow the money, because the money is documented even where the claims are not. Edward Klein and Christopher Anderson rode their uncorroborated accounts, anonymous sourcing, and fictionalized dialogue and all, straight onto the New York Times bestseller list, painting Carolyn as an unstable, abusive addict who dragged a prince to his doom. Michael Bergen cashed it in with his memoir in 2004, and publishing records preserve every last sale. What none of those pages preserve is a single piece of primary evidence for any of the central accusations. Then, slowly, the people who actually stood in the room started writing. Carol Radziwill, who lived through those final years beside the couple, while her own husband lay dying, published What Remains in 2005. Rosemarie Terenzio, John's executive assistant and close friend, answered with Fairy Tale Interrupted in 2012 and rejected the divorce claims outright. In 2019, historian Stephen Gillen granted access to John's private papers with the estate's cooperation, dismantled the drug and divorce allegations clause by clause. Elizabeth Beller's 2024 biography and the Terenzio and McNeil oral history, released the same year, finished the job, recasting Carolyn as a rational, capable woman responding normally to a form of stalking that nobody regulated and everybody monetized. The same unchained press culture the world only began questioning after the death of Princess Diana. The correction took a quarter of a century. The lies took a weekend. Go back to the photograph one last time. The dark suit, the white silk, the kiss on the hand, the chapel steps in the soft Georgia light. In 1996, we read it as a beginning, the opening page of a storybook. This country waited 30 years to reopen. Knowing everything the record now holds, it reads as something else entirely. The last fully private day. Those two people ever engineered for themselves. The final quiet hours before the encampment formed on Northmore Street and never once packed up its cameras. Strip away both sales pitches and look honestly at what remains. A marriage that fought, sometimes loudly, once in a public park with a lens watching. A marriage that booked the counseling appointment instead of the divorce lawyer, that held a dying cousin's family upright through the worst year of their lives, that absorbed a collapsing magazine and a 3-year siege without either partner ever signing a single separation paper. Their closest friends never claimed any of it came easy. They claimed something much harder to sell, that under pressure heavy enough to flatten most of us, these two kept choosing each other anyway. So no, the marriage never matched the love story we were sold in 1996, all silk and effortless magic. And it never matched the horror story we were sold after 1999, all cocaine and lawyers and curses. The tabloids called her cold, her friends called her hunted, and the federal government of all institutions ended up publishing the only account of her that ever passed a laboratory test. One photograph built the myth, and two industries fed on it for decades. And the marriage itself, the flawed, tested, stubbornly loyal thing at the center of all that noise, belonged to nobody but the two people who died still holding on to it. They kept it. We just sold the pictures.